if I were going to generalize, which I am, I suppose, about the people that are here, some of the words that I would think about are thoughtful, visionary, thoughtful, introspective, thoughtful, aware, thoughtful. So I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if that's right about you, but I like thoughtful people. So what does actually a study of humor have to do with thoughtfulness? So have you ever thought of laughter and thoughtfulness are often not associated. So do you ever think of thoughtful laughter? Do you ever read a story in which Susie laughed thoughtfully? It doesn't happen. When I think of comedy in general, when I think of comedy in America, so whether it's stand-up comedy, whether it's what you might find and laugh at on YouTube or on social media, I don't think of intellectual astuteness. In fact, I tend to, if a movie is labeled as comedy, I'm probably not going to like it. Maybe it's because I take myself too seriously, but my gut reaction is that's just stupid. The etymology of the word amusement, when we are amused, we are amused. So there's a lack of musing, a lack of thoughtfulness. In the Bible, when you're making merry, it often means you're drunk. So it's not associated with good choices, with clear thinking, with thoughtfulness. Also, if we laugh something off, we're choosing not to take it seriously. So how can studying humor in literature, how does that work with thoughtfulness? How can it enlighten us if humor is it's associated with being devoid of thought? The simplest answer, I would say, is that in that moment when we are taken off guard, when we're not thinking, if we stop and look back and think about that and pay attention, I think it can lead to meaningful insights. So a bit of a thesis, sort of, is if there's really more to humor than the guffaw, then analyzing and thinking about humor can be an into understanding literature. It can open doors to the less than obvious insights into characters, into the author, into the values, the cultural values, and into ourselves. And that's basically why, as far as I know, we study literature. We're looking for insights. We're looking for that aha moment. We're looking for ideas that explain and shape the way that we think, the way that we see the world through characters, the themes, historical context, our own values and beliefs. So it's basically like truth coming in the back door. So to understand humorous literature in the way that I'm talking about it, let's think a little bit about its opposite. So what would you think, so in general, thinking about what might be the opposite of comedic or humorous literature. So tragedy and comedy are often paired as opposites. For obvious reasons. There are stylistic differences, but I don't know. Some tragedies can be pretty hilarious. So I come to the end of Hamlet, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to laugh or cry with this imaginary stage, if you're reading, pretty much strewn with bodies, like so many fallen dominoes. Why is that funny? But but it is reasonable to say that tragedy and comedy are in general different. But if you're going to define humorous literature as literature in which the truth is coming in the back door, then maybe the opposite. If we're laughing, we're not thinking we're not thinking really hard about the shoulds and the should nots, what the moral of the story. So if humor cloaks its message and it appears innocuous, then maybe the literature on the opposite end of the spectrum is the moralistic literature. the kind of story that doesn't crack a smile, that has no surprise in it. We know exactly what's coming. Everything that should happen happens. We've all read these stories, so many of us are from a conservative Anabaptist background, so we are probably familiar with these heavy-handed stories that don't cloak the moral of the story. First I wrote barely cloak, and it's like, they don't cloak. So the predictable plotline involves the main character committing some kind of act of disobedience, promptly meeting undesirable consequences, and then, of course, the story ends with, and we actually can find this funny now, predictable and rapid repentance, and a clean conscience. So, the moral here is obvious and easy to pick out. There's no missing it. There's no question. There's no real psychological dilemma. Regardless of what the truth looks like, the author tells us exactly what to think. So what I love about humor is that, aside from helping me not to do too much navel gazing, it lets the truth in the back door. Here's a quote from the Cyclopedia of Wit and Humor of America, published originally in 1858. It's a 669-page PDF. It has also been printed you can buy it for like $100, I think. So thinking about truth coming in the back door, Joseph Neal wrote, "It is a theory of mine that those gifted with truly humorous genius are more useful as moralists, philosophers, and teachers than the whole legions of the gravest preachers. They speak more effectively to the general ear and heart, even though they who hear are not aware of the fact that they are imbibing wisdom." So this morning we've got a variety of experiences with studying literature. And so just a little bit of a plan, layout of what I hope to do this morning. I'm going to briefly discuss why we read literature, maybe a little bit about critical theory and how that led me to humor as a lens. Then we're going to look at humor and laughter in general, study it, and then finally we will look at some literature and look at literature and practice the use of using the lens of humor to understand it. So how, when, where, why do we read literature? I used to read mostly for escapism. And I'm not going to totally diss that, because reading literature is fun and it's pleasurable, and sometimes we read it for enjoyment. Obviously, I preferred happy endings when I'm reading for escapism or pleasure. To what level it's healthy to read for escapism is another topic, but my first class in literature, studying literature in college, was a mixed experience. I was really excited, and the kinds of literature that we read were not what I had expected. It's not what I had been exposed to. The stories were much more nuanced. They were less feel-good. They were more exploratory. So things like The Death of a Salesman, A Rose for Emily, A Good Man is Hard to Find are stories that I read in my first literature class. And we discussed these stories, and I wrote essays about them. And as I did this, I realized that I learned, basically, to read for more than pleasure. And I found that in itself was a pleasure. But rather than just mindless entertainment, I would say that literature students in general examine the story. They make connections. They see what's happening between the lines and behind the rhetoric of the stories. So I switched majors from education to English because I love doing this. I love reading stories and drawing philosophical connections. Philosophical connections. There is actually philosophy in literature. And I think philosophy and literature are pretty closely related, actually. Studying literature is inextricably tied to our philosophies about life, our values, our worldviews, the way we see the world. And I learned this more clearly in grad school. I had one class that was actually a bad experience, and another one that was not so great. They were heavily theory-laden, and in a lot of ways this is outdated because most people realize that looking at literature through particular theories is maybe not the most helpful. But let me explain a little bit about what happened here. So the very basic explanation of critical theory is that it's a lens through which we critique society, critique culture as we're reading. So I took a critical theory class in which I needed to write a paper, my final term paper, critiquing, in this case it was movies, by using two different critical theories. This was a way of testing my knowledge of the theories and my understanding. So I could look at the works from a feminist perspective, for example, in which, if I were doing that, I would pay attention to how the women were treated, who was in the position of power, whether a man or woman had written it, whether the women characters had a voice, or whether they simply stood there and looked pretty. How were they treated? Writing from a post-colonial perspective meant that I would evaluate the work by asking questions about minorities, how colonizers were treating the minorities, assumptions made about minorities, how were dialects in the literature, did it make fun of or humiliate particular cultures. Writing from a Marxist perspective, I would look at everything as a class struggle, as an exchange of wealth and commodities. I would read a story looking for these things. Writing from a psychoanalytic perspective, I would examine characters for unconscious desires, for ways they'd been traumatized, or what were their suppressed longings, that kind of thing. And there were others, but these were some of the more obvious options, and I think that this serves my purpose so you understand what it means to look at literature through a lens of, in this case, critical theory. So everyone else seemed to have hobby horses. Everyone else seemed to care about feminism or care about race or care about Marxism. And their theories, they had a theory that reflected their values. And I struggled. I felt like I saw truth in all of them, but I wasn't loyal to any of these particular theories. And sort of a side note and an interesting thought is, so what is a Christian theory? What does Christian critical theory look like? I've wondered, so does it look for redemption? So I actually did use that somewhat, looking at stories, what changes in the human, or where is redemption happening? So that's one way, but and I'm sure some of you have brilliant thoughts about what that might look like. But with this background, so when I came to the idea of using humor as a lens to study literature, it was a saving grace. I was thrilled. I was like, yes, let's study humor in literature. It was a way to avoid all of this politically correct or incorrect ideology that I didn't feel like hashing and rehashing again. So humor is a lens, and that's what I'm coming to. Humor can be a way of looking at literature, a way of approaching literature. So it highlights the things that we look for, the questions we ask as we read, what we notice. We follow it and see what insights we find. So I took a class on humor in antebellum America, so before the Civil War, and I was considering considering that humor is, funny. People can get really serious about theories on humor, as I discovered. But, which I actually enjoyed the theories of humor and theoretical discussion. So we started the class by studying humor. So just thinking about laughter, think about it, why we laugh. What are some observations about laughter? So here's a collection of them. Laughter is social, so we often laugh with other people. We don't often laugh alone. Now, sometimes we're having conversations in our head and we laugh. That's possible. And it's also possible to be reading. You're having a conversation with the author, sort of, and you can laugh. But I find myself with the impulse that if I read something funny and I laugh out loud, I look up and want to tell Darrell what happened. Or someone, So it's a social thing. We laugh together. We're influenced by what our social group thinks is funny. So I was always amused. I always liked puns, but my year at Faith Builders, everyone was full of punning. That actually shaped my sense of humor because that particular social group, puns were funny, and they are. But and I see puns differently, I think, probably through that. They can be more than lame. But so what the person next to me is laughing at, I am inclined to laugh at too, because laughter is by nature so social. Because it's social, or along with that, humor transcends borders. So it might be borders of culture, it might be borders of language. So I've been in situations where I'm surrounded with non-English speakers. We don't understand each other. We cannot speak. But if there's something that we laugh at together, there's a connection. It's social, so it transcends those borders. Also, if you're on a crowded subway, or if you're on an airplane and something funny happens, you laugh. There's that sense of camaraderie. I have a little motto thing in my house that says, laughter has no foreign accent. It transcends those boundaries. Also, laughter is hard to explain. Simon Critchley said, a joke explained is a joke killed. It's difficult or impossible to translate jokes between languages. Jokes are often associated with cultural groups. So you might find Anabaptist humor shares a sense of humor. Anabaptists share a sense of humor, possibly. I lived on a Native American reservation for a while, and the Ojibwe sense of humor was very distinctive. You can just sort of tell, well, that's their kind of humor. So it's very social. It connects you to a group. Humor or laughing can show our values and shape our values. So what are we laughing at? And what happens if we laugh consistently and often at racist or dehumanizing jokes? Does that affect our values, and at what point? Also, when we laugh, we feel less defensive. We feel more susceptible to ideas. They can come in the back door. So thinking of satire, this definitely makes use of that. But then does that also mean that we accept values, we accept statements that we wouldn't otherwise accept because we're laughing? So a little more about laughter. So laughter, we laugh with pleasure. Sometimes we laugh not because something is funny, but because we are delighting in an experience. Sometimes I've laughed with pleasure at words, like not because it's technically funny, but because it's just wonderful. Laughter is instinctual. It's sort of physical. You can't quite stop it. Like if you are tickled, you don't think, I want to laugh. It's an instinctive, reflexive process. It's contagious. Sometimes I laugh without knowing why I'm laughing because someone else is laughing, especially a child. And it's also associated with language. So, there's some controversy about whether or not some animals are capable of laughing. But in general, I would say it's accepted that thoughtful people, thought and laughter are connected. So we've thought a bit about laughter. There's all kinds of things about laughter, and you can't put it in just a couple main points necessarily. But I want to stop here, and I would like for you to have just a little bit of a discussion, just within 2 or 3 people. So, given what we've just talked about with laughter, how, when, where, why, in what situations, or why is humor useful? What is laughter good for? In what situations? So, like, when is a joke helpful? I'd like for you just to think about it just a little bit. Actually, why don't you stand? My students hate when I make them stand. I'm telling you, it works. So just have a little bit of discussion for a couple minutes. When is laughter useful? So you've indirectly hit to mental health. Humor is good for mental health. So mental health, it diffuses tension, like you said. It also diffuses embarrassment and discomfort. So Ojibwe people laugh at themselves a lot. And that was one of the first things that I learned when I entered their culture. It's like, you've got to laugh at yourself. You have to be willing to laugh at yourself. Don't take yourself too seriously. And I found that some of the best experiences came from, I would tell a funny story about myself that I was really embarrassed that, the white girl was standing there waiting for a boat. She didn't know the boat doesn't come here, I mean, things that may or may not be funny necessarily, but it was an embarrassment to me, the white girl, and they loved that. I mean, they would, do you remember that time you were standing there? It's the laughing at yourself. But what it does is, instead of being really embarrassed and taking myself way too seriously, I can laugh about it. So it diffuses embarrassment. Laughter is just for pleasure and entertainment, quite frankly. That's often why we're laughing. And that's the no-brainer, but we got to mention it. And it makes truth palatable. So a lot of you probably, when you think of literature of humor, you think of satire. So that's when we are critiquing and criticizing, but we do it with laughter. The critique of a society, a culture, set of values. But it can also signal that there's no offense intended. So we can say difficult things, but we're not. I can say a difficult thing, but I'm not holding it against you. So they're along with going with the church, laughing in church. It can make truth palatable, and it can show that there's camaraderie, there's good feelings there. So I mentioned satire. Even if humor in literature, or if humorous literature is not necessarily satire, it still can reveal values. It can reveal the values of the author, of the time period, and of the reader. So, like, just Pride and Prejudice is not considered satire typically. It's not, I mean, most people, you wouldn't, like, what's the funniest book you ever read? It probably wouldn't be Pride and Prejudice, but there's definitely a lot of humor in there. Like, oh, my nerves. You don't understand. I'm terrible at quoting directly, but oh yes, I've lived with your nerves for many long years. I know them quite well. Or even the opening line, it is a truth universally acknowledged. I'm terrible at quoting exactly, so I'm sure there's so many smart people here who can do it. But it's a truth universally acknowledged that a man in possession of a fortune must be in want of a wife. A single man. Thank you. It changes the idea. And actually, this is just a side note, but I was thinking about this, and I have a feeling that the immediate audience would have found a different kind of humor in that, because they know immediately that it's the woman who is in want of the man. It is not the man who is in want of the woman. So it's funny on actually several levels. But, so it reveals values. So Pride and Prejudice is an example of a book that's revealing values and cultural foibles without necessarily being satire. And humor in literature is also a chance to evaluate ourselves and others. So who are we laughing at? That's a question that I asked a lot as I read with this in mind. So who are we laughing at? Who is laughing at whom? And this is important because of that concept that tribes, that there are barriers, or there's groups, we form groups around our humor. So if there's a group laughing at one thing and someone else is excluded, that's something to pay attention to. There can easily arise a sense from us versus them. So even if you're in a group and you see a couple people laughing uproariously, even though they have done absolutely nothing mean-spirited toward you, it can highlight your feeling of loneliness or feeling like you are on the outside because of the laughter happening over there. Thinking about how that it affects the group dynamic. George Orwell said that the British Empire was built on two things. One, nothing ever changes. And secondly, foreigners are funny. So, and if you look at, I mean, there's a lot of disturbing literature out there. This concept that the foreigner is there to be laughed at. In that it basically allows you not to take them seriously. If they're funny, we don't need to take them seriously. We don't need to consider that their way of thinking is on an equal level as ours. So we've talked about humor. We've talked about laughter. I'm not going to go deep into theory, but I'm going to mention three of the most popular, widespread theories of humor, and why people laugh. They're not necessarily exclusive because it's just impossible to nail it down. But the umbrella theories, one is superiority, the idea that we laugh, sense of superiority. Superiority, incongruity, and relief theory are the three theories. So first of all, the superiority theory is the idea that we laugh because we feel superior. I resisted actually. I thought, really, do I do that? But you see someone slip and fall in the mud. It's funny. Well, it didn't happen to me. We don't like to think that we are like that, but we do laugh when someone else is stupider. So they didn't get that, or we laugh at ignorance. If someone else is uglier, if someone is less fortunate. Also, there's the idea that we are in the know. We get it, and we laugh. We know what the butt of the joke is. Now, practical jokes work this way. So, you think of whatever practical joke you want, and it's funny to watch the other person get water dumped on them, or fall between chairs, or whatever it is. It's funny, and it's associated, theorists say, possibly with this sense of superiority. We will come back to that a little bit more in a moment. But the other one is incongruity. The idea, and this goes along with the idea of surprise. So there's incongruity, is that we are surprised by something. What we expect to happen and what happens is different. So wordplay is actually often based on incongruity. Sarcasm even. There's an incongruity between what you're actually saying and what you mean. Yeah, right. Incongruity, there's also the sense of what is absurd. We laugh at absurdity. Something that's ludicrous evokes laughter. Role reversals is a big one, and we will get back. We have an example of that in a minute too. So those are incongruity. For the release and relief theory, there's the idea that it happens that laughter happens in a process of tension buildup and then release. So Freud was on this one. Build up. So there's a build up to a punchline. thinking of knock-knock jokes or any kind of joke that starts with a question. So why did I can never remember jokes for all my. Yeah. Anyway, so the tension of the unconscious. That's actually even a little bit with the sense of when we've got this really big theological discussion happening, and then we're just waiting actually for a reason to laugh. So that sort of this release and relief theory has noticed that's pretty important to laughter as well. And then this is not a theory, but it's also it is something that I want to highlight. I think we also laugh out of pleasure, and I said this before, but we do laugh with pleasure. I think I covered that before, so I just want to highlight that. So before we move into looking into some examples in literature and looking more closely at these theories and laughter in literature, there's a question that has bugged me for sort of a long time. Is the Bible funny? Is God funny? It sounds almost sacrilegious even to say somehow. But does he have a sense of humor? I mean, there's a part of me that definitely, I don't want God to be too serious. So what do we see in the Bible? So this is a question, actually, I'm going to have you discuss among yourselves. There are articles, so I've read articles of people talking about humor in the Bible. And often they feel stilted to me. They feel like they are taking the garb of one culture and trying to put it on another. So what we would find this funny. Well, that doesn't mean that the original readers would find it funny. So it tends to feel a little stilted to me, and I don't like that. But thinking about laughter as pleasure, God's pleasure is something that comes out often. Here I've just got a couple examples. Pleasure in creation. In Job, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy? In the Old Testament and in the Psalms, there are people shouting for joy, and that I can see God shouting for joy in creation. I can't quite imagine a creative God who took pleasure in his creation, maintaining a sober countenance as he conceived the hippopotamus, or stretched the neck of the giraffe, or popped out the eyes of the bullfrog. Also, in the Bible in general, I see there's the ludicrous, and that's one thing that leads me to think that God must have a sense of humor in some way. There again, I might be placing things on him, but trying to understand here the connection. So the idea of Gideon with 300 men and clay pots routing an army. The idea of Samson using the jawbone of a donkey. Losing his strength with a haircut. Shepherd boy with a slingshot. It's ludicrous. Elijah's fire after the prophets tried for Elijah or Elijah. Thank you. Tried for days and days. Surely someone laughed. So there is definitely the ludicrous, and he has a sense for that. Jesus, the idea of a king born in the barn. There's something there. Also, just the idea. Now, this is something I read. Someone had the idea of a widow persisting and knocking at the judge's door would have actually been funny because they would have all known. I mean, widows were dependent on others, so the idea of God saying, "This is what you can do. You can be like this woman next door that you know about." So the ludicrous. And then also, the idea often happens of God laughing at his enemies. So this goes along with the sense of superiority. In this case, it's real. The superiority is. The idea of laughing at your enemies, the idea of laughing to scorn. I don't associate that always with kindness, but that's my culture. So, does anyone have something they would like to add to that? I don't have conclusive answers, obviously, but those were just some of my observations. All right, so thinking about superiority, this is where I'd like to introduce, I took a class in medieval women in literature, and I wrote a paper. This was so fascinating to me. I told you I was really thinking about humor here. Humor in martyr literature. It doesn't, it's not typical, but Hrotsvit of Gandersheim is actually a well-known, she was one of the first and most well-known medieval writers. She was the first known dramatist, so she actually wrote some plays. I'm going to read just a little bit. I'm actually going to read part of the introduction to what ended up being my paper. The medieval hagiographic tradition historically stands as a source of spiritual edification, thinking morals, and inspiration, hardly the place we turn to for a good laugh, teeming with stories of repentance and holiness, self-deprivation and martyrdom, cloistering and self-denial. The medieval monastery does not seem like the appropriate place for telling a good joke. A closer look at the medieval tellings of saints' lives, however, troubles the simplistic portrayals of these stories as solely edifying. In Hrotsvit of Gandersheim's Dulcidius, the evil-minded captor repeatedly accuses 3 virgins of madness because of their determined clinging to Christ and their refusal for earthly marriage. So I'm going to read a little bit of an excerpt here. So there were 3 virgins who were being put to death because they would not recant. They would not deny Christ. So they were put in chains and kept in the squalor of prisons. And Dulcidius talks about how beautiful they are and how he would like to marry them, and someone else tells him, no, they're not going to do that because they're loyal to Christ. They have different values. And then there's this scene in which the 3 virgins, I'm not exactly sure how this works, but they're peeking through a door or something. Agape, Hyrena, and Cheonia are the names of the 3 virgins. So Agape, what is the noise outside the door? That wretched Dulcidius coming to the fore. May God protect us. Amen. What is the meaning of this clash of pots and pans? Irena, I will check. Come here, please, and look through the crack. What is going on? Look, the fool, the madman base. He thinks he is enjoying our embrace. What is he doing? Into his lap he pulls the utensils. He embraces the pots and pans, gives them tender kisses. Ridiculous. His face, his hands, his clothes are also soiled, so filthy with all the soot that clings to him. He looks like an Ethiopian. It is only right that he should appear in body the way he is in his mind, possessed of the devil. Wait, he prepares to leave. Let us watch how he is greeted and how he is treated by the soldiers who wait for him. So, switch. Soldiers. Who's coming out? A demon, without a doubt, or rather the devil himself. Let us flee. Dulcidius. Soldiers, where are you taking yourself in flight? Stay. Wait, escort me home with your light. Soldiers, the voice is our master's tone, but the look the devil's own. Let us not stay. Let us run away. The apparition will slay us. Dulcidius, I will go to the palace and complain and reveal to the court the insults I had to sustain. Basically, the virgins are laughing at what is a miraculous twist of fate in which there's madness and there's baseness. He he is hugging and kissing sooty pots and pans. Then he walks out looking black, and so there's further laughter. There's laughter at this absurdity, laughter at this respectable, dignified man not being, obviously not being respected or not even being recognized. So the question here, so that's an example of superiority. And then basically the case that I make is that Horatzvit entertained her audience as well as edifying, which was a little bit different and unusual. But in martyrdom, the way it edified actually was it reversed who is winning. So they died in the end. I actually have a much more eloquent piece here from an interpretive essay that explains how that a theorist or how someone can look at humor in this. Horatzvit's humor, then, while subversive, is by no means radical. She does not supplant the patriarchal paradigm. She never questions the moral or ecclesiastical hierarchy of virtues and the virginity's place at their pinnacle. What she does is to appropriate and invert the paradigm, presenting a hierarchical system of her own in which the young and the female often reign, and where the joy of religious devotion is practiced with a smile at the absurd and ludicrous inferiority at the foe, and perhaps equally the absurd and ludicrous tradition of patriarchal pretensions. So that's an example of someone else pulling slightly different things out of it. But it's an example of how looking at humor can lead to new insight and into a character, into what was going on, into a tradition. So Durrell, my husband Durrell, so he teaches Bible studies for the homes in the church. The church that I attend, we have Hope Homes for people who are recovering from addiction. So we're involved with that. And he uses Dr. Seuss, Yertle the Turtle, to teach about submission. How many of you know Yertle the Turtle? Good. Because I don't think I have time. No, I know. I don't have time. Okay, I don't have time to talk about it at all. I just realized. But Yertle the Turtle. So what happens? Oh, see, this is like I'm telling the joke, and you're not going to get it instead of reading it. But what happens is there's a king who is thirsty for power, and he is the king of all he can see, but he is in the pond, and he can't see much, and he wants to be the king of so much more. So what he does is he gets other turtles, lowly turtles, to just a moment. Lowly turtles, he stands on them, and then he can see more and more. So his power is increasing, right? And before you know it, he can see far and wide. He is the king of all he sees. And the turtles below are saying, "Please, oh please, spare me." And what happens is there's a little turtle named Mac at the very bottom of the stack. And Mac burps. This upsets the entire stack. And the story ends with the king of all you can see, which is nothing but the mud. So this is humor that works. I mean, you can laugh at it, but if you stop and look at what's happening, you can ask, well, who are we laughing at? Are we laughing at the king? Yes, we're laughing at the king, so there's superiority. But there's a role reversal. The person that we think should be in power is actually usurped by the lowest and lowliest of turtles. The connection to submission, then, is that we are all in submission to someone. And sometimes who appears to be the leader is, authority and leadership is not necessarily a sign of value or importance. All right. So Aslan has just created Narnia. I'm going to be in the way here. Nope. Oh, thank you. Aslan has just created Narnia. So think about reading this, and then think about what we will go back and think about the humor and what it says about the humor. I guess I do need to read the whole thing. Creatures, I give you yourselves, said the strong, happy voice of Aslan. I give to you forever this land of Narnia. I give you the woods, the fruits, the rivers. I give you the stars and give you myself. The dumb beasts who I have not chosen are yours also. Treat them gently and cherish them, but do not go back to their ways, lest you cease to be talking beasts. For out of them you were taken, and into them you can return. Do not so. No, Aslan, we won't, said everyone. But one perky jackdaw added in a loud voice, no fear! And everyone else had just finished before he said it, so that his words came out quite clear in a dead silence. And perhaps you have found out how awful that can be, say, at a party. The jackdaw became so embarrassed that it hid its head under its wings as if it were going to sleep. And all the other animals began making various queer noises, which are their ways of laughing, and which, of course, no one has ever heard in our world. They tried at first to repress it, but Aslan said, laugh and fear not, creatures. Now that you are no longer dim and witless, you need not always be grave. For jokes as well as justice come in with speech. So they all let themselves go. And there was such merriment that the jackdaw himself plucked up courage again and perched at the cab horse's head between its ears, clapping its wings, and said, Aslan, Aslan, have I made the first joke? No, little friend, said the lion, you have not made the first joke. You have only been the first joke. Then everyone laughed more than ever, but the jackdaw didn't mind and laughed just as loud till the horse shook its head and the jackdaw lost its balance and fell off, but remembered his wings. They were still new to it before it reached the ground. And now, said Aslan, Narnia is established, and we are going to end there. There's so much, and it's almost like a primer on humor. Not quite, but there's so much here that shows C.S. Lewis sort of exploring the ideas of humor. First of all, the jackdaw was embarrassed, so he hid his head under his wings, and out of the we'll touch on that later. Then all the animals began making queer noises, and it's the idea that is associated with language. The dumb beasts don't laugh. Aslan says, fear not and laugh. Jokes as well as justice comes in with speech. The superiority, the jackdaw laughing, or the jackdaw losing its balance and falling off the horse. That's another reason we laugh. There's just so many different kinds of things we're laughing at here. But what I want you to think about probably most here is if you were writing, I know a lot of you are writers. If you are writing and you're thinking about, you've just created a new world, how can you tell your reader what kind of a world this is? The fact that the jackdaw embarrassed himself leads to the question, so what is going to happen in this world? In some worlds, there was shame, obviously, so what's going to happen with this shame? Well, in this world, it was okay to laugh. In this world, the jackdaw feels embarrassment and might wonder, is he going to be ostracized? Is everyone else going to say, oh, yeah, that's him. He did that. Is he going to slide into lower in the hierarchy of smarts? Is he going to be considered stupid? What's going to happen? Will the cool kids not hang out with him? So what happens tells you what kind of a society it is. Aslan laughs with him. So this is an example, I guess, of what I've always loved that passage, so we can sit and laugh at it. But if we were to go back farther and say, well, how is this humor working? What does it accomplish? I would argue that it can create new insight. So, in closing, as readers, I would say, pay attention to why you are laughing, pay attention to how you are laughing, pay attention to when you are laughing, and at whom and why. Who's the butt of the joke? What is it distracting you from? What does it say about the cultural values of the people you're studying, of yourself? Is it a diversion? Writers, Consider how humor might appear in your work, how it might change and strengthen it. If you're having a long theological discussion in your poem, what would happen if you flip it and add a little bit of humor? Humor can be more than a laughing matter. And then finally, as Christians, as readers, as writers, and as Christians, seek to take pleasure in the truth, knowing that humans were meant both to think and to laugh. Thank you.